It is about time for us to go ahead and begin class this morning. We're going to be continuing our study of 1 Corinthians. We're going to be in 1 Corinthians chapter 7 this morning. It's a big, kind of a longer section, but we're going to try and get through it all this morning. Before we begin our study, would you bow with me and we'll go to God in prayer. Father, as we come before you this morning, we are grateful for the time we have to spend together as brothers and sisters in Christ and to worship you and right now to study your word. Pray that you would just bless us to have open hearts, to be humble as we approach your word, and to be seeking to know you better, seeking to deepen our relationship with you and our love for you, and seeking to become more of the people that you would have us to be. We thank you for Christ, and it's in his most holy name we pray. Amen. All right, so we'll kind of recap where we have been in 1 Corinthians thus far. If you recall, the first 4 chapters of this epistle are mainly Paul addressing a lot of the divisions and just kind of infighting and factions that have sprung up in the Corinthian church. And he spends a lot of time trying to explain to them why those things are so problematic. And it really seems to tie back to a mindset that has become prevalent, it seems, among the Corinthians, that they're really trying to exalt themselves. And they're kind of trying to follow a version of the gospel that's been distorted to be more about self-glorification rather than the mindset of self-sacrifice and service and giving glory to God. And a lot of that theme of struggling with glorifying self versus glorifying God goes through throughout the rest of the epistle. In chapter 5, he starts to transition out of that discussion of divisions and into some of the questions and difficulties they're having with their sexual conduct, their sexual immorality that's going on, and that is not being addressed. And simultaneously in chapter 6, we find out that there's other things that are going on, other kinds of disagreements that while the sexual immorality is being tolerated, there's other things that should be tolerated or dealt with in a more, compromising way, rightly, that they're not. And they're taking each other to court and they're suing each other over disagreements they should be able to resolve. But then when there's sin that is prevalent and obvious, that's something that they're not addressing and are very willing to tolerate. And so now in chapter 7, we're going to kind of transition a little bit again. I see chapters 5 and 6 as being somewhat attached to the issues of the divisions in chapters 1 through 4. But he starts to get into some more specific questions about sexual immorality. And now in chapter 7, he's going to kind of use that also as an opportunity to answer some of the questions that the Corinthians had asked him, because they've written to him before this letter and asked him about a number of issues. And so now, starting in chapter 7 and kind of throughout the rest of this letter, he's going to be addressing a lot of the questions that they have for him. And so chapter 7 kind of attaches on to 5 and 6 because it's related to what he's already been talking about. The way that this class is going to proceed will maybe be a little bit different than the vibe we've had normally, just because we've already studied chapter 7 relatively recently as part of our marriage and divorce class, or the lessons that Barry's been doing. So I'm not going to spend a ton of time digging into this in the same way that we have with some prior sections, because we've already spent several, Sunday evenings talking about this earlier this year. What we'll do more is kind of go through this relatively quickly, and just as we go through each section, talk about some of the key points and kind of use it as a review. I also want to use it as an opportunity for us to maybe think about some of the pieces of this that aren't directly related to questions of marriage and divorce. That was kind of our angle when we've studied this before, and certainly that is a core component of what this chapter is about. But maybe this is also an opportunity for us to have some discussion of pieces of this chapter that are not necessarily related to that discussion of marriage and divorce and dealing with those kinds of situations. So let's start off with verses 1 through 5 of chapter 7. Now concerning the matters about which you wrote, it is good for a man not to have sexual relations with a woman, but because of the temptation to sexual immorality, each man should have his own wife, and each woman her own husband. The husband should give to his wife her conjugal rights, and likewise the wife to her husband. For the wife does not have authority over her own body, but the husband does. Likewise the husband does not have authority over his own body, but the wife does. Do not deprive one another, except perhaps by agreement for a limited time, that you may devote yourselves to prayer, but then come together again, so that Satan may not tempt you because of your lack of self-control. All right, so what things jump out to you? What do you see as the key points in this first section? Yeah, so there's one man, one woman. It's kind of this idea of exclusivity in that relationship. We talk about the idea of the wife having authority over the husband's body and the husband having authority over the wife's body. And by extension, nobody else gets to kind of mess with that dynamic. Nobody else has any authority within that relationship. What else? Yeah.
Gives an out to the lack of self-control to sexual immorality. So it just lays out the overarching message is you could have self-control within these conflicts.
Yeah, so it's kind of relating back to, I think one of the purposes of marriage is to have a appropriate bounds for the sexual relationship, and Paul's kind of outlining, that's part of what the marriage relationship is like. It's not appropriate to just go around having sex with whoever you want to. There's appropriate, relationship for that, and there's not authority to do that outside of that. What maybe is the question that Paul is answering with this?
Verse 1 says it's good for a man not to have sexual relations with a woman. Like that statement in and of itself kind of catches itself off guard. Without qualifying it.
Yeah.
All these other things.
Okay. So what maybe then is the question that they're asking? I think you're on.
What do you mean by that, Paul? What do you mean by verse 1?
Oh, okay. So here's a question. Does Paul think that it is good for a man not to have sexual relations with a woman? No? Okay.
It seems to be that this is what they were writing, and they were making this statement, and that's part of their question that they were asking about. It seems to be, in the ESV it's in quotes, so it seems to be he's quoting them saying this, and they are wanting him to clarify what does sexual intimacy look like. Is it good that we abstain completely, or how should we approach it?
Yeah, so it seems like what's going on is they've written to him, and they're kind of like, so it's good that a man does not have sexual relations with a woman, right? Like that's what you're saying. And Paul's kind of taken a step back and saying, no. And you can understand how, particularly given what he's talked about in chapter 5 and 6 about the gravity and the severity of sexual immorality, how they would say okay, well is it okay even for a husband and wife to be having sexual relations? And so it seems like there's some confusion about should we be abstaining from sexual relations altogether? And what Paul is trying to clarify is that's not what I'm saying. I'm clearly making a prohibition about sexual immorality in chapters 5 and 6, but in the marriage relationship, that is where that is appropriate. Anybody else have anything they wanted to add on to that or other thoughts about that? Yeah.
The way the last chapter ends with our bodies being the temple of the Holy Spirit. In the extreme reaction in Corinth was, so does that mean we shouldn't do anything flesh-based, basically, including having sexual relations? Our body's sacred.
Yeah.
And should it be kept apart from anything in this world? That could have been an easy reaction based on Paul's explanation. And I'm sure he taught this principle to the person he was informed that they're writing about. They're not writing because this question obviously coming about because of what's in chapter 6. They heard that before.
Yeah.
And I think this is a springboard for what's in chapter 7. This question, so should we not have intimacy with any,
Yeah.
in any scenario?
Yeah, and you can almost feel him kind of like anticipating their like counter question to what he's talked about in 5 and 6 with this. I think it's easy to understand how maybe they would get the mindset of like, okay, like maybe we're supposed to be like monks and like we only eat like lentils and like abstain from any like, and Paul's kind of trying to clarify, and he'll go into that a little bit more throughout the rest of this chapter. It's like, no, you just need to like abstain from the things that are immoral. What are the thoughts do you all have about these first 5 verses? Yeah.
In chapter 9, he's going to state the fact that he particularly has a right to have a wife, but he chooses not. He chooses to be single. And that's good. I think that's a statement. That's good. But it's not necessary.
Yeah. There's I think confusion maybe that he's trying to clear up around, I guess what kind of things are necessary versus not necessary, and he's kind of trying to illustrate that like don't make this harder than it has to be to a certain degree. Let's jump into the next couple verses. Let's read 6 through 9. Now, as a concession, not a command, I say this: I wish that all were as I myself am. But each has his own gift from God, one of one kind and one of another. To the unmarried and the widows, I say that it is good for them to remain single, as I am. But if they cannot exercise self-control, they should marry, for it is better to marry than to burn with passion. All right, so what key points do you all see in these verses? Yeah.
To exercise self-control and singleness is a gift that we see in verse 7.
Yeah, so I think it's interesting that he refers to it as a gift. Certainly that wouldn't have been the tone of the culture of the time. And so it's interesting that he refers to being single, being unmarried as a gift. I think he gets into the idea later on in this chapter of, well, he gets into it right here even, of like, some people are married, and that's a gift of its own kind, and some people are single, and that's a gift of its own kind. What other thoughts do you all have? Yeah.
Just to put a point on that question, I think the way to address that is to say, is Paul saying here that nobody should be married? And I think it's pretty easy to answer without saying, no, that's not what he said. Not saying that no one should be married.
Yeah, certainly. He's not prohibiting marriage by any means. Yeah. Or saying that it's a bad thing at all. Yeah. What else?
There are some things going on. He's going to go on to say that may make it really difficult to do right now. And that's kind of behind what he's saying in this chapter.
Yeah, it seems like, we'll get into it a little bit later, but it seems like at least in the current situation that the Corinthians are in, maybe there is a greater advantage in that particular circumstance to being single than at other given points in times relative to being married. And perhaps at other points in times there's a greater advantage to being married than there is to being single. What Paul seems to be driving at is that kind of whatever situation you find yourself in, single or unmarried, to approach that as a gift. What else?
People of Corinth, as far as the citizens of Corinth, they were not the most godly people in the world, and because you're around all of them all of the time, it's easy to get caught up
Yeah, it seems like one of the advantages that you might encounter in Corinth in particular is if you're in this culture that is particularly lascivious, it's helpful to have some help in having that kind of self-control, I guess. And Paul seems to be emphasizing that being single well, to a certain degree, is dependent upon one's ability to exercise self-control. Like, he's not advocating for I guess, monastic degree of celibacy in a way that is, I don't know, self-flagellating, I guess, or just making things harder than it needs to be. But he's trying to illustrate that there are advantages to being single that should be accounted for. And I think that is maybe the key takeaway for us today, because certainly probably in most churches, and certainly in this congregation, there are people who are married and people who are single. And sometimes it can be difficult, I think, to, if you're part of one group, relate as easily to people from another group. You know, if you're in a couple, maybe you hang out with your couple friends. If you're single, it's kind of like, man, why do I want to hang out with these people who are like married with kids and never want to go do anything fun? But I think what Paul's illustrating is both of those circumstances are to be taken as a gift, and it's important for us in whatever situation that we have to appreciate the gift of people in other situations and not allow that to become a barrier or a division or just a cause for distance. Because I think whether you're single or married, you probably need people in the church of both kinds, both in a collective sense and in your individual relationships. Any other thoughts on this? Yeah.
I think even though it might be best under the circumstances to be single, you cannot abandon the marriage relationship. In normal circumstances, it's not good for a man to be alone, and God hates divorce. So this is kind of an opposite of the situation we're in most of the time. Our society and churches, as far as what do you say, Rome or Ephesus or whatever, just seems to be a very peculiar situation that is kind of opposite of what we normally be looking at.
Yeah, I think that's a good point. To interpret this as Paul just saying, well, it would be better all the time if everybody was single, would be to discount some of the ideas of like the things that are said in Genesis, or even what Paul talks about in 1 Timothy, where he talks about the younger widows getting married and having children. Of like, that would even contradict with what Paul himself says in other passages. So it seems like there's something going on at this point in time, persecution or whatever, that makes it particularly advantageous to be single, at least in this context. Let's go ahead and read verses 10 through 11. To the married I give this charge, not I, but the Lord. The wife should not separate from her husband, but if she does, she should remain unmarried or else be reconciled to her husband, and the husband should not divorce his wife. All right, so what are some key points here? This deals a little bit more directly with questions of marriage and divorce.
He's talking about it's not me that's saying this. It's like,
Yeah.
in my version, it talks. He says, "I give this command, not I, but the Lord." So it carries more weight on maybe in their minds that it's not me that's talking about it; it's the Lord that's talking about this. So listen up.
Yeah, so he's emphasizing that this is something that is coming from God, and you would very easily be able to like cross-reference this with things that Jesus himself said about this. So it's clear that what he's saying here isn't the first time this has ever come up. Like, this is an established principle from God, not from Paul. Yeah. What else?
There's certainly some confusion that can come from thinking that divorce and separation are two different things. I think separation, separate with no intent whatsoever to come back together, it's viewed the same as divorce.
Yeah, I think that's interesting. I wonder if some of the confusion around that comes from our current legal situation, I guess, where in the United States it's possible to get a divorce, and it's also possible to get a legal separation, which is a different thing legally in the United States. But in this point in time, that doesn't exist. Either you're married or you're divorced, and there's not really like this like legal separation category. So I wonder if some of that confusion is just we've kind of retrofitted our own like 21st century American definitions onto this. But if we look at this through the lens of the people who would have been reading it, separate, divorce, exact same meaning. You're splitting up and ending the marriage, essentially. What else?
I don't know. I'm pretty sure that my marriage is not any different from a lot of people, because there's been a couple of times in my 27 years of being married, my wife has told me, you just need to leave. And that would mean that I need to not only exit the room, but exit the house, to give her time to collect her thoughts and for me to collect my thoughts. A couple hours later, I come back in and then we can sit down and talk, because I think nowadays I see a lot of people that wife get mad at the husband get mad at the wife about something. A lot of times it's triggered, but the next words out of their mouth, I'll just leave. We'll get the divorce. How about it? And I think that because it says when your wife is not to depart from her husband, but even if she does depart, let her remain unmarried and will be reconciled to her husband. In other words, they can get back together. But it falls in a husband is not to divorce his wife at all. And I think that an easy way out, a lot of people, they don't work. They don't try to work on their marriage. Marriage is something just like a garden. If you want the fruit to grow, you got to pull the weeds out. Every once in a while, you need some of those weeds that don't want to come up out of the ground. No matter if it just rained 2 days before, they're going to come out of the ground for a while. And you got to work all around it, not kill the plant that's around. Finally get it out of the roots and get it on the out of there.
Yeah, it would certainly be dangerous to, because Paul does seem to give somewhat of a qualification in verse 11 where he talks about, if a wife does divorce her husband, this is how to handle that situation. So it seems like Paul does give some sort of a qualification, and it would be really dangerous, I think, to interpret that as categorically, divorce is something that's on the table if you're not getting along. Particularly, I can just, get divorced and, because I don't like this person or whatever, and as long as I stay unmarried and I don't remarry, that's fine. It would be, I think, very dangerous, to your point, to take this passage that way rather than doing the right thing of, let me put in the work to nurture this relationship and grow it to a healthier place. What other things you think are key points in this? I think probably the last thing we would want to call out is the qualification that Paul gives here is a little bit tricky, because he does acknowledge the fact that there might be a situation where, for example, a wife divorces or separates from her husband. And kind of like we were saying before, that's not, I think, meant to be a categorical license for divorce for any reason, or the idea that you can just divorce and remain unmarried. It seems like what Paul is trying to account for is there might be situations where sexual immorality isn't going on, but for whatever reason, you're in a marriage where you're in danger, or your kids are in danger, or there's some sort of like serious crisis where your ability to be faithful as a Christian and your life or limb is in danger. You know, there's physical abuse going on, your spouse is selling drugs or involved in some sort of crime, where in order for you to remain safe, you need to get out of that relationship. And clearly Paul's intent is hopefully that the spouse who's causing the problems in that relationship is able to resolve so that they're able to be reconciled. But I think Paul's trying to acknowledge the fact that there are tricky situations where in order for you to be safe, you might need to exit the relationship. But that isn't, that is the exception to the rule. That's certainly not the rule. And it would be dangerous for us to, I think, approach that from a standpoint of, well, divorce is an option for me to consider if things just aren't going well in my marriage. Let's jump into 12 through 16. To the rest I say, I, not the Lord, that if any brother has a wife who is an unbeliever, and she consents to live with him, he should not divorce her. If any woman has a husband who is an unbeliever, and he consents to live with her, she should not divorce him. For the unbelieving husband is made holy because of his wife, and the unbelieving wife is made holy because of her husband. Otherwise your children would be unclean, but as it is, they are holy. But if the unbelieving partner separates, let it be so. In such cases, the brother or sister is not enslaved. God has called you to peace. For how do you know, wife, whether you will save your husband? Or how do you know, husband, whether you will save your wife? All right, so maybe the place to start with this section is, what was the question here that the Corinthians might have asked Paul?
So I have something written that I wrote before. Possibly consent with their marriage causes them to be single due to Old Testament Jewish laws not to marry outside Jewish nation. But marriage is from the beginning, therefore it is considered acceptable, holy.
Yeah, so I think potentially we're dealing with a situation where Paul has come in and taught in Corinth, and he's maybe taught one spouse who accepted the gospel and believed, and one spouse who didn't. And so now you have a marriage where one person is a Christian and one person is not a Christian. And so in the Old Testament, there's these situations where the Israelites were forbidden to marry foreign wives. And when that happened, they had to divorce those wives, like in Nehemiah. And so you can imagine how if you are a Christian who's married to somebody who is not a Christian, you might be wondering, well, does this mean that my marriage is sinful, just like it was sinful for the Israelites to be married to the Canaanites? Do I need to divorce this person because they're not a Christian like I am? And what Paul is, I think, generally saying is, no, absolutely not. That is not the idea here. That command about not marrying foreign wives was a command to the Israelites. But marriage is, as you said, something that goes before the old law, and you've made a marriage commitment to this person, whether they are a believer or not, you're married to them, and that's okay. What other key points do you see in this section?
He talks a little bit about, if the wife is content to stay with the husband, the husband is content to stay with the wife, and that's, if you are a Christian, your husband is not, or you're a Christian, your wife is not, but they're content with that, then stay in a relationship. We don't know what kind of influence or you might have on that person, whether through study or whatever, and you can convert that person, or that person could become a Christian. It sounds like in some of these households, there's not a lot of contention going on, that the wife or the husband is not saying, I don't like that you're a Christian, I don't stay in those and don't separate. You can be a good influence on that person.
Yeah, it seems like the idea that he's getting at is the ideal situation is this person consents to live with you and you can stay married, and through that, potentially you're a good influence on them and are able to bring them to know God over time, even if it's not happening in the moment. Yeah. What else? Yeah.
I noticed the language of holiness and unclean, and I was curious about that, and I started thinking about how in the Old Testament, like any time you touched something that was unclean, you were unclean. But then when Jesus came, when he touched someone that was unclean, he made them clean. And so it's like a reversal, like the new kingdom is like a reversal of that. We, as extensions of Jesus' kingdom, or as Jesus' kingdom, have the potential to make other people clean, or bring about life that in the old law would have made us unclean. So it's like a reversal.
Yeah, I like that. I had not thought about that parallel in that imagery there, but I think that's great. One of the things that I wanted to call out, and we're running out of time, so we'll start moving through this a little bit quicker. But the idea of, in such cases, the brother or sister is not enslaved can get a little bit tricky, because that might sound like you're not required to stay married to that person and go ahead and remarry whoever you want. It's essentially equivalent to if they cheated on you. And I don't think that is the idea that Paul is driving at. Certainly if somebody says, well, you're a Christian and I refuse to stay in this relationship with you, you cannot force that person to stay with you. But I think that when Paul says the brother or sister is not enslaved, the idea that he's trying to get at there is, I think that you're not obligated to compromise on your faith as a Christian in order to make a marriage work with somebody who refuses to be married to a Christian. That similar to how you're not required to obey the government if the government is commanding you to disobey God. If your spouse is pushing you to compromise on your faith and is refusing to stay with you because you're a Christian, you're not required to compromise on your faith. You're not enslaved to their will to the detriment of your relationship with God. You are supposed to put that first, even if that does mean that person is refusing to be with you.
They're also not under bondage, fulfill the demands he's given earlier in the chapter.
Yeah.
To give their fiscal due, you're no longer bound by that part.
Yeah.
Because they've chosen to.
Yeah, they've chosen to leave, and you're kind of.
You don't share in their sin because you have failed to do that. I think that's right.
Yeah. Let's go ahead and jump into verses 17 through 24. Only let each person lead the life that the Lord has assigned to him and to which God has called him. This is my rule in all the churches. Was anyone at the time of his call already circumcised? Let him not seek to remove the marks of circumcision. Was anyone at the time of his call uncircumcised? Let him not seek circumcision. For neither circumcision counts for anything nor uncircumcision, but keeping the commandments of God. Each one should remain in the condition in which he was called. Were you a bondservant when called? Do not be concerned about it. But if you can gain your freedom, avail yourself of the opportunity. For he who was called in the Lord as a bondservant is a freedman of the Lord. Likewise, he who is free when called is a bondservant of Christ. You were bought with a price. Do not become bondservants of men. So, brothers, in whatever condition each was called, there let him remain with God. All right, so what key points do you all see in this section? Yeah.
One of the words he uses in the beginning of this chapter is gifts. He talked about there were gifts that people had of being single, being able to remain single, not being tempted in the same way.
whatever condition you're in, don't allow that to be an excuse or an obstacle to serving God in the way that you can. Yeah. What else? Yeah.
I think 16 in this verse 24, you do everything you can do to convert that person to save their soul. And then the other rule is you remain with God. So there's your two options. Whatever situation you want them to be a Christian and do whatever they can to save their soul and value their soul. Whatever they decide to do, you remain with God.
Yeah, I'm glad that you tied it into the previous section, because I think that's important to consider the fact that this is, I think, connected to what he's already talking about and trying to illustrate that for example, if you're in a marriage with somebody who's not a Christian and they consent to live with you, your objective is to try and save them and be the best influence you can on them for God and for their soul. But your priority is to remain with God. And if it happens that that person separates from you, like you're not enslaved to them, that's the condition that you're in right now. And your role at that point is serve God and as best you can in whatever capacity that looks like in that situation. Maybe one question that we should ask about this is, if we're supposed to remain in the condition that we're called, are there limitations on that? Is there any sense in which we should not remain in the condition that we're called?
If we were called in a sinful condition, we're not to remain in that sinful condition.
Yeah, exactly. So, for example, let's say that I'm in a marriage that is not scriptural. This isn't the idea that, like I was called in this second marriage that I have after I left my first wife. I guess that I'm just supposed to remain in this sinful marriage. The idea here is that when your condition is not related to your spiritual state, such as I'm a slave, I'm free, I'm married, I'm not married, accept that condition and serve. It's not licensed to not alter the condition of your sin and change. I think in one of our previous discussions, somebody made the point that to interpret it that way would imply that part of our calling is not to repent. Like, we have to acknowledge that fundamentally our calling is to repent and to be transformed. And so to interpret this to say that, well, this is license for me to remain in whatever sin I find it convenient to remain in, is to completely disregard the, higher calling that we have to be transformed by the gospel. Any other thoughts or things that you all see in this section? All right, let's wrap up really quickly. This last section is a little bit more straightforward, but let's read 25 through 40. Now concerning the betrothed, I have no command from the Lord, but I give my judgment as one who by the Lord's mercy is trustworthy. I think that in view of the present distress, it is good for a person to remain as he is. Are you bound to a wife? Do not seek to be free. Are you free from a wife? Do not seek a wife. But if you do marry, you have not sinned, and if a betrothed woman marries, she has not sinned. Yet those who marry will have worldly troubles, and I would spare you that. This is what I mean, brothers. The appointed time has grown very short. From now on, let those who have wives live as though they had none, and those who mourn as though they were not mourning, and those who rejoice as though they were not rejoicing, and those who buy as though they had no goods, and those who deal with the world as though they had no dealings with it. For the present form of this world is passing away. I want you to be free from anxieties. The unmarried man is anxious about the things of the Lord, how to please the Lord. But the married man is anxious about worldly things, how to please his wife. And his interests are divided. And the unmarried or betrothed woman is anxious about the things of the Lord, how to be holy in body and spirit. But the married woman is anxious about worldly things, how to please her husband. I say this for your own benefit, not to lay any restraint upon you, but to promote good order and to secure your undivided devotion to the Lord. If anyone thinks that he is not behaving properly toward his betrothed, if his passions are strong, and it has to be, let them do as he wishes. Let them marry. It is no sin. But whoever is firmly established in his heart, being under no necessity, but having his desire under control, and has determined in his heart to keep her as his betrothed, he will do well. So then he who marries his betrothed does well, and he who refrains from marriage will do even better. A wife is bound to her husband as long as he lives. But if her husband dies, she is free to be married to whom she wishes, only in the Lord. Yet in my judgment, she is happier if she remains as she is. And I think that I too have the Spirit of God. All right, we've just got a couple minutes left, but what key points do you all see in this section? Yeah.
I won't go into too much, just because there's so much here, but he uses this section to really tie the whole rest of this chapter together. I mean, it all ties together. But parcel of that is, it's just fascinating reading this chapter, and I never quite thought about it this way, but if you were to try to break this out, everything that he's talking about, into like a matrix, and tie everything together, it would be absolutely fascinating to see. There is no way that without inspiration, he could have covered the amount of ground that he covers in this chapter. It wouldn't have been possible. Man can't write. I mean, the amount of acreage that he covers in here in such a short amount of time, with such a brief overview of each one, is absolutely fascinating. I've never quite looked at it that way before. Because the situations are boundless that he actually wraps all together and addresses.
Yeah.
So anyway, he uses this section to basically close out a lot of the deal up to that, as well as address some other situations. But yeah, just to talk about how fascinating the inspiration thoughts are put down.
Yeah, I haven't thought about it that way, but that for sure is true. Any other key points you guys think it's important to call out? Yeah.
For someone who's not married, he understands a lot about the relationships in all the different facets that he describes here, which if you're not married or before I was married, it seemed very difficult for me to understand really the detail of what he's talking about here and what he actually does understand and appreciate in the different relationships.
Yeah, and he's very clear about what is his opinion and what's not, and kind of very, I think, fastidious about making that clear and not presuming to place his own opinion on the same level of authority as God. I think, if we were to sum this section up, this is about people who are betrothed, and that doesn't really exist in like 21st century America. But you might parallel this to somebody who's engaged or maybe has a boyfriend or girlfriend. And it seems like what Paul is saying is, hey, in regards to the present distress, whatever that is that's going on, it's maybe better to hold off on getting married. And that's kind of the sum of what he's saying. I think kind of the key thing to wrap this chapter up is the idea that it's a gift whether you find yourself to be married or single or whatever other condition you find yourself to be in. The priority is, how do I use that situation to serve God to the best of my ability? Maybe regardless of whether or not I'm enjoying that situation, how can I use this and use what God has given me in this situation in a positive way to glorify Him? And how do I navigate that when potentially that gets tricky? That's all I've got for you. Sorry that was a little bit different and felt pretty rushed, but I think we got through it all. Next week we will be picking up in chapter 8. So thank you all for your comments.